right? Praising God and thanking him once again for the chance to start yet another book of his word. This time, the book of Micah, a book that isn't all that different than some of the prophets I've talked about before because I don't always understand, especially the minor prophets on my first few times through. But beyond perseverance, I think God might have shown me a relatively simple structure for this book, at least one that's relatively straightforward as I understand it at this point. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 1, it's a familiar start though, with the context in which Micah is prophesying, meaning during the reign of which kings is he talking and who is he talking to. This time it seems like he is talking both to Israel and Judah with some familiar themes that I think we might get a slightly different perspective on. Understanding that once again, God's judgment on his people is going to be a thing here. This time, one of the things that Micah is going to emphasize is the way that the sins of Israel seem to have almost caught like a disease, stretching as far as the capital of Judah, Jerusalem. And so not only is he rebuking Israel for what is soon to be their fall, he's going to talk about the way in which it seems their sins are going to linger on even after their fall in small ways in Judah, eventually producing a fall in Judah as well. And with that, he's going to start out in chapter 1, talking about the way that God's presence is a thing in his judgment, much like Ezekiel seemed to talk about God's presence, except Ezekiel talked about it from the perspective of God was appearing as one hovering or seated above the cherubim on his way out of Judah. This time it seems that Israel has gotten God's attention in the way that a parent might say, not all attention is good attention. And so the dirt that they have been doing has finally risen up to heaven, and God is coming down to deal with it as Micah portrays him in chapter 1, coming down to see his people. Chapter 2 is going to describe the things that they have been doing, meaning they have been working evil to the point where it seems to have become habit forming. And it's not simply become a habit because by the time you get to chapter 3, it is going to have penetrated their heart so deeply that they are finding joy in the habits that they have developed in doing each other dirty in Israel. At which point, in chapter 4, Micah is going to seem to describe the rebirth of Israel, for lack of a better term, in some terms that seem really similar to the way in which Isaiah, one of his contemporaries, is going to describe the way in which God is going to restore Israel. Chapter 4 of Micah, describing the way that the mountain of the Lord is going to rise above all the other mountains to be the tallest mountain among the mountains, which at times represents kingdoms of the earth. And that seems to be exactly what Micah is describing here, as chapter 5 is going to describe the way in which the ruler he is going to establish in Jerusalem or his amongst his new people is going to sound an awful lot like the anointed one of the Christ that Isaiah describes in prophesying or pointing forward to the Christ, as he is then going to, in chapter 6, describe God's indictment against his people, as he is then going to go in chapter 7 for Micah to seem to have a moment of reflection as to how bad things have actually gotten around him and how he is going to not only acknowledge his role in it, or much like Isaiah, confess his own sins, but he's going to talk about the way in which he is going to trust God to bring a renewal that he is committed to wait for, as he is actually going to ask God to prepare him to bring him into the restoration of his people. Another sub-theme that's going to seem to subtly be woven through Micah's latter half of the restoration chapters is that concept of a remnant, as he seems to hopefully look beyond God's days of judgment to the time of renewal. But taking chapter 1 in sequence, it's going to start off, like we said, with that context. Micah preaching during the reign of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, understanding that Israel is on the way out. He does not make his ministry relevant or relative to the kings of Israel, even though it's going to say he is speaking to or concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Verse 2 is going to put a call for all to hear, meaning the peoples of the earth, all, and the earth itself, all of it, to understand that God is about to be a witness against his people, if no one else. And beyond merely being a witness against his people, he is coming down to deal with his people. understanding that verses 3 and 4 don't simply describe the way in which he is coming down to deal with his people, but the devastating effects it is going to have on them. Verse 5 giving us a because statement, saying it's because of the transgression of Jacob and for the sins of the house of Israel. But it is not simply their sins, it is those sins, as we mentioned, that have found their way down as far as Jerusalem to infect the southern kingdom as well. Verse 6 saying, therefore he will make Samaria a heap. Likewise in verse 7, their carved images, understanding that they have built a lot of their prosperity from the, what he's going to call fee or the wages of a prostitute. Therefore he is going to return their wages, presumably to their source. Either way, he is not going to let those wages be the source of prolonged success. He's bringing it to an end, as he's going to go on to talk about in verse 8, where he is going to say he's not simply bringing destruction to them that is going to harm them. He is going to presumably or seemingly lament and wail for what is about to happen, reminding us of the prophecy through Jonah to Nineveh. Even those who aren't his people, God has a heart for, showing us that he is invested not only in the lives of the animals that needlessly suffer, but the people who needlessly suffer through poor choices. And so just as the word is going to go on to say that God does not glory or find joy in even the death of the wicked, likewise, he seems to be lamenting and wailing what is about to happen to his people Israel and eventually Judah. Verse 9, reminding us, for her wound is incurable and it has come to Judah. It has reached to the gate of my people, to Jerusalem. As verse 10 begins to give us, I think, a more detailed description of what the judgment or the downfall is actually going to look like, giving us a number of specific cities or locations between verses 10 and roughly 12 that may be important because of their physical location within the path of destruction, but it may also be metaphorical. They might be puns for the way in which the destruction is to unfold. Places in particular, like in verse 10, Beth Afra, and in verse 11, Za'anan, are potentially word plays on what the coming destruction will look like. Verse 12 will then go on to talk about the way in which these things do not necessarily rectify themselves quickly, talking about the way in which some will wait anxiously for good in the days of difficulty. The latter half of verse 12 reminding us that just as the sins of Israel seem to have infected Judah, likewise, God is coming down, or the destruction that God is bringing is going to reach down to Judah and Jerusalem as far as the sins have reached them. Likewise, in verse 13, he is going to go on to talk about the way or the method through which they might have been corrupted, understanding that historically in that time period, it was an attempt to rectify the strained relations between Judah and Israel that actually helped to lead Judah astray. Jehoshaphat, a relatively good king, wanting peace so badly with Ahab that he was willing to compromise the integrity of his people to make peace with the king who had basically committed himself to still do dirt. And so what's happening is it is not only the relationship between Judah and Ahab that has caused them trouble, but the ethical compromises that they're going to make to have peace with the Syrians and the Philistines are eventually going to prove to be more trouble than they are worth. Verses 14 through 16 describing the way in which, I'll just read it, the houses of Achib shall be a deceitful thing to the king of Israel. Which reminds me that I need to make another clarification that the house of Achib may simply be another play on words for the Hebrew term for deception. However, the deception is that none of these houses, whether foreign or domestic powers, are in the line of the throne of either Israel or Judah. Nevertheless, they are having an outsized influence on God's people. Micah seeming to give us yet another example from the prophets of the way in which those who weren't genuinely interested in the things of God still found a way to have undue influence over God's people. As chapter 2 will seem to describe the way in which the undue influence might have led to a decline in character among God's people that eventually attracted God's judgment.